Good afternoon. This is the new Pan-African show called Afreeqa. We would like to wish all our Orthodox Christian followers Malkam Fasika, Happy Easter. Today we are actually as you can see, in a beautiful house. We have a great guest, so I'm going to allow him to actually introduce himself. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Welcome. So I'm Alula Pankhurst. I grew up in Ethiopia, and my parents and my grandmother also lived here till the end of their lives. And this is home for me, and so welcome here.
Thank you. So in your own words, if you could describe who Alula Pankhurst is.
So usually it's left to other people to describe who you are, but I'm an anthropologist. I studied anthropology at Manchester University, and I first studied languages at Oxford University, and I taught at Addis Ababa University for 16 years, and so on various aspects of Ethiopian society I've written some writings, and I'm also a product of my family background. My father was a historian, and my mother was a librarian, and my grandmother was also somebody who wrote about Ethiopia and cared about Ethiopia and came to live here. So I'm also a product of that.
Beautiful, because since you've mentioned your parents and grandparents, our next question is actually regarding that. Our great-grandparents were dear friends in London. Please briefly describe to a young Ethiopian audience who the great Sylvia Pankhurst was and what she has done for Ethiopia during World War II.
Thank you. So my grandmother Sylvia started her life as a painter. She went to Italy and to Florence to paint, but she was also very influenced by her mother and her sisters who were suffragettes in England and who campaigned for women's rights. So she was part of that movement, and when her mother asked her to come back and work for the movement, she abandoned her work as an artist and joined the cause. And very rapidly she became worried about the rise of fascism in Europe, and she'd already seen that when she was in Italy. And then, of course, the beginning of the Second World War was Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and so very early on she became aware about the Ethiopian resistance to the Italian occupation. And she was a journalist, and she had a newspaper that was called the Women's Dreadnought that emphasized women's campaign for women's rights. And then when she became a socialist and had left-wing ideas, she transformed it into the Workers' Dreadnought because she felt that women's issues and labor issues were interconnected. But then when she saw the rise of fascism and she decided to devote herself to campaigning against Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, she founded a newspaper called New Times and Ethiopia News. And she got to know the Ethiopians in London, including Azaj Workana, your great-grandfather, and who was the Ethiopian ambassador in London and had a distinguished career, having left Ethiopia as a child taken by the British after the Makdala expedition, and then growing up in India, becoming a medical doctor, going to Scotland, an amazing career, coming back to Ethiopia. And so she got to know Hakim Workana, and they worked together in campaigning, first of all, to make people aware that there was resistance to the Italian occupation, that the patriots were fighting against that, and that the Italians were using brutal techniques, and the British and the Europeans were not very sympathetic to the cause of Emperor Haile Selassie, and when he was in exile in Bath, and so she met him. And you can actually see up here, this is a tapestry by Swedish woman but it's based on a photograph that my father took of the Emperor and Sylvia in Bath. And you can actually see that it was taken by a child because the angle of the photograph, he was 10, 11 at that time. And so Sylvia was very much trying to help the emperor's cause, and also work closely with Hakim Workana on this. And that's how she became interested. And so she started, as well as her newspaper, which she published for 20 years, New Times and Ethiopian News, she wrote a cultural history and was interviewing the students, the refugees, and became fascinated. And so she was by then an elderly woman in her 70s, and just decided when the war was over she had to come to Ethiopia because it was so much become part of what was important to her life. And she came on a second visit and decided to stay, and lived the rest of her life, the last few years of her life here, and started being a journalist. She started Ethiopia Observer.
Okay.
And your mother Eleni and her were very close, and in fact Eleni was very instrumental in commemorating the 50th anniversary of Sylvia's death. She died in 1960 and was buried in Selassie Cathedral, and was in some senses, this was her home, and the emperor appreciated what she had done during the occupation. And Ethiopia Observer was published first monthly, then quarterly, that described what was going on in the country, in culture, in arts, in development. She traveled a lot, even though she was an elderly woman. Also was very interested in social services, so she was the Social Service Society, and helping people who were in difficulties, girls' education. She still remained and had an interest in women's issues when she came here, and traveled a lot and visited and wrote about it. And then my father followed in her footsteps and continued publishing Ethiopia Observer till the revolution period, till the mid-70s. And my mother joined him here, and they lived here, and the rest was
history, as they would say.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming back to our next question. You mentioned New Times Ethiopian News. Now, in the corner of this newspaper, it says Abyssinia for Abyssinians. Can you tell us a little bit about what that message, because I feel like it's a message, because it's in the corner of the newspaper on the right.
Yes. So if we look at the context of the mid-20th century there, most countries in the world were either colonizers or colonized, and most of Africa was colonized. Ethiopia had managed to survive due to some very astute rulers, and also its isolation and its geographical position. And Ethiopia had managed to remain independent throughout this period, except for that 5 years period of the Italian occupation. And so I think Sylvia believed very strongly that the intention of the big powers, of the colonial powers of Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and so forth, and Belgium, was still in the making. And so Britain helped the emperor, in the sense, gave him refuge in Bath, even though they didn't recognize him as a proper head of state. And they did help him to come back to Ethiopia, but they still controlled all that. And after they came, they were still thinking of keeping Ethiopia as a protectorate, and were in Somaliland. And so Sylvia, as someone who was very against this and fought against this, she was very wary of the intention of the British. And even over Eritrea, she had a very clear stance that Eritreans were fighting for being part of the Union, and the British wanted to keep Eritrea as a protectorate. So she was somebody who really very strongly argued that the British had to recognize Haile Selassie as the emperor, and that Ethiopia was a sovereign state, and she was campaigning for that. So not only did she campaign against the Italians by promoting what the patriots were doing in the resistance, which was the British and the others were pretending didn't exist, but once Ethiopia was liberated, she wanted to make sure that Ethiopia continued to be an independent country. And the other African countries were not yet independent at this period. And in fact, my father, one first book he wrote was A Tale of Two Nations, which was about Kenyan struggle for independence with Jomo Kenyatta and so forth. And the British were so upset with this book that when my parents got married, nobody from the embassy was allowed to come to their wedding. So one person defied that ban, but still. But just to say that Sylvia had this position that Ethiopia needed to remain independent, and that if that meant going against the British foreign policy, which she did consistently. I mean, her newspaper had difficulty being published because it was considered seditious at the time. And she came under threats from Mussolini, and so it was something she believed in very strongly.
Wow, such history we have. Thank you for actually giving us this opportunity. You've mentioned a few things about, not a few, but quite a lot about your grandparents and parents. But I would like our audience to know what they have actually done for their adopted country, Ethiopia.
Right. So my father followed a bit in the footsteps of his mother. So first of all, he continued publishing the Ethiopia Observer with Rita, with my mother together. They co-published it till the revolution period. And he started teaching at the university in the history department, and he specialized in economic history. So a lot of his life was devoted to writing books about Ethiopian history and teaching at the university. And he became a director of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies and campaigned for having a good library, including a new library. And towards the end of his death, towards the end of his life, he campaigned for a new library. And so he wrote books on different aspects of Ethiopian history. So a lot on economic history and the early period, the introduction to economic history, which was his speciality, but also other things, a social history, a history of medical history, another one on history of the borderlands. And in addition to that, he very much believed in a kind of more populist approach to make history alive for people. So he wrote more easy books, a history of the chronicles, history of travelers, Ethiopia engraved, of a picture book of the engravings, and another one, Ethiopia photographed, of the history of early photographs. So, and Ethiopia in pictures. So he really believed that it was important to make history come alive for everybody and make it accessible. So he did his academic work, which was much more, full of footnotes and references, and where he was very much a compiler more than an analyst. Many other historians are brilliant analysts. He was much more giving the basics, and then other people could then interpret it. So his books tend to be a bit long and a bit heavy and a bit full of footnotes and just having everything in there. But he also liked to make it kind of accessible. And perhaps most significantly, following on from his mother, he had an activist streak in him. So, he felt very strongly, well, first of all, he would write columns in newspapers and was very open to interviews with the media, press, and so forth. So very often he would, give interviews and so forth. But also he would write about the wrongs and injustices of the colonial and the occupation period. So he got very much involved in with a lot of colleagues in the university and pressure groups to campaign against the atrocities that were committed during the Italian occupation, and the injustices of the looting during the British period, during the Magdala period. So he was very much involved with starting with colleagues, with Professor Andreas and artist Zarihuን Yetungeta and Tasfaye Zellalo and others, and in both the campaign for the return of the Aksum obelisk, which was raised in the parliament here by Fitarari Ahmed Lemma. And so he worked with these people, campaigned both on the Italian occupation period, but also Afromet, the Association for the Return of the Magdala Ethiopian Treasures, which tried to convince the descendants of the soldiers who were in Magdala to return objects that were looted. And many of them, 20 or so objects, were returned, including some Tabot Arks of the Covenant and shields and manuscripts and paintings and various other objects. So he had this campaigning streak, and he would publish in Addis Tribune. He had a particular column in Addis Tribune which was called at some point How to Destroy Your History. And so he was being controversial there. So he would publicize when there was a house that was knocked down, like when Sheraton was built, and there was a Ligabat Aso's house, which was a beautiful house, which could have been preserved along with there. And he would put out How to Destroy Your History in an ironical way. So he tried to make history alive by in Addis Tribune, and then in the Capital newspaper, he had a weekly column, and he had that energy to produce, not just academic work, but also weekly outputs like a journalist and an activist on these questions of restitution and rights. And so, when people would talk about this Aksum obelisk, and they would have their meetings, and people would say, well, it's just a piece of rock. And what we need from Italy is, development projects, not some silly, restitution of some object. But he really believed that would happen, and I didn't believe it would happen. And, banging away at the door until it opened, he and the colleagues and friends and the association did succeed. And also with Afromet, they did manage to convince a lot of people to return looted objects. So I think he had that mixture of being an academic and somebody that set the ground for a lot of Ethiopian historians to dig and build and criticize what he had written and take it further, and making that groundwork, but also the popularizing Ethiopian history, making it accessible with images, histories for children and for tourists, and with the books on photographs and engravings. And then this activism streak of that he inherited from his mother of really saying, well, the wrongs of history need to be righted.
Yeah. Since we're on the history subject, what do you think about our university? We were having issues on our history department, right? Students didn't want to learn their history. Do you know anything about it? Were you in the university when that was going on?
So I taught 16 years in the university,
and
I enjoyed particularly going with students, going on field trips, and working with enthusiastic young people to writing their theses. And so I was not really part of the politics of the university, and after 16 years actually found that I was getting so interested in the research topics that I was involved in that I still continued and continue to advise students and to examine theses and so forth. But I no longer do any routine teaching, and many of my students are now there. And so in a sense, my being there or not is not so important. But yes, the quality of teaching and the question of making people more aware of their heritage and their history and being proud of it and liking it, even though there are controversies and so forth. I think there's a lot that needs to be done, and there are a lot of very competent and good historians who are trying to publicize and make the younger generation aware and proud and enjoy and learn about their history.
You've also touched on this. After 150 years, England returned to Ethiopia. I think from England was 13 pieces, and then there were 3 from Belgium, I think, Magdala religious artifacts. You mentioned them, including as Theodoros's dread. Please describe the process.
I think I need to backtrack just a tiny bit, if you'll allow me.
Sure.
So when there was the Magdala expedition, the British came, and Emperor Theodoros committed suicide rather than surrendering. And the British came and got at the top of Magdala, this tabletop, and then looted, set fire, cut from Emperor Theodorus's dreads, took bits of his clothing and ripped his amulet, and really behaved just like invaders, and burnt the church and there was looting, and then the officers stopped them and took all the loot and collected it, and then had an auction and sold it. And the people who bought most of it, the British Museum had sent a representative, Richard Holmes, and he had loads of money, so he bought a lot of it. Then the richer officers bought many other things. And then they came with elephants, and they loaded up these elephants with these booty and these loot, and went to the coast and left with this, with poor Prince Alamayo and Hakim Warkana, who was a young child at the time. And so they had these elephants and these boxes of loot, and so a lot of them ended up in museums. And so there are maybe over 1,000 objects in museums. There are maybe 500 manuscripts. Rita, my mother, wrote a paper on where the different manuscripts are, and there could be up to 1,000, but there are at least 500 that can be clearly identified as coming from Magdala. Most of them in the British Library, and British Library has done something great. They've digitized almost half of them already and have provided digital copies, at least, to libraries and institutions in Ethiopia. So a lot of them are in museums, but there are also loads of objects that are with the descendants of the soldiers. Now, what happened was, after Emperor Theodorus died, the next emperor was Emperor Johannes. And Emperor Johannes, he asked for the British to return only 2 objects. He asked back for the Kibra Nagast, and he asked back for the Kurata Rasu. So the icon, which is a picture of the Christ with the crown of thorns, was one that the kings used to take into battle. So it had a lot of significance. And then the Kibra Nagast is one that legitimizes the Solomonic dynasty, because it has the whole story from the Queen of Sheba, etc. But also in the marginalia, in the sides of the manuscripts, they often have land deeds, court cases, and so forth. Historical records, which are important as a kind of a history of what went on, and that can be used in disputes and so forth. So what did the British do? And Richard wrote about this and popularized it in some of his writings. And so they said, they found 2 Kibra Nagasts. And there was one that was beautifully illustrated with paintings, and they kept that one, and they sent the other one back. Then the painting, the icon, they said, we can't find it. Actually, it was in the private possession of Richard Holmes, who was the British Museum curator, and then the curator of the Queen Victoria. And then afterwards it got sold in an auction. It's ended up in Portugal in a bank vault, where it still is. Now, in the 20th century, to move forward, when Emperor Haile Selassie went to the coronation of King George, the Brits thought, well, maybe we should give them some kind of gift. And they thought, well, at that stage it was Empress Zewditu. And normally they would give a decoration or something. But she's a woman. And so with the sexist views at the time, they said, no, we can't give her a decoration. So they thought, well, let's see if we can find something. And they thought, well, let's give her a crown. And they found 2 crowns, a beautiful golden one and a one that was silver. And guess which one they said? Silver one. So the British minister here handed over this. And when Queen Elizabeth came on a state visit in 1965, she also brought a few things. She brought the seal of Emperor Theodorus, and also an aklila, one of the crowns of the patriarch. So there was this history of a few things that were returned in the 20th century. But then what really happened was Afromet. So the Association for the Return of the Magdala Ethiopian Treasures, that pressure group started to campaign. And it was really successful, because these descendants of the soldiers, they had these various objects, and they don't mean very much to them. Having a shield here, there was a professor, Fiona Watson, in Edinburgh, and when she heard about it, she found this shield, and And she returned it. And they even found 2 tablets lying around in a cupboard in a church.
Wow.
And when those tablets came back to Addis, there was jubilation, and and these objects are now in the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, beautifully displayed and so forth. And
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do they know what tablets are?
No,
I mean, why did they take it to begin with? Just because?